is George Tinker, and why are we reading his book? We've heard Gordon Kaufman discuss God as creativity, Sally McFague's pantheological viewpoint, Dolores and Williams and James Cone have introduced us to their liberation-oriented theologies. But if I've learned anything so far, it's that one person's theology may not speak to all. As Gustavo Gutierrez is focused on Christianity as a liberating force of the Spanish oppressed, so George Tinker makes liberation of Native Americans the driving force of his theology. Not unreasonably. His credentials are impressive. His mother was a Lutheran married to a member of the Osage Nation, and though he's an ordained minister of the Lutheran Church, he prefers his father's culture and spirituality. Pastor of Living Waters Episcopal Lutheran Indian Ministry in Denver, Colorado, he is also on the Leadership Council of the American Indian Movement of Colorado and director of Four Winds American Survival Project. This stance of one foot in each world gives him a unique perspective from which to develop his theology. He can see both sides of the question, and I believe is well qualified to preach to both the oppressors and the oppressed. Tinker begins in his introduction by declaring that, quote unquote, an American Indian theology must be a political theology, especially considering the doctrine of discovery that has influenced our laws from Supreme Court on down, and indeed the way we, as privileged whites, treat anyone of a different race. Tinker carefully enumerates those deep structure cultural differences. 1. Indigenous traditions are spatially based. Euro-Western traditions are rooted in temporality. Simply speaking, that means that Native American values, social and political structures, ethics, spirituality are centered in occupied space, place. Euro-Western emphasis is on time, progress, money, development. Space is not valuable for its shared community use or sacred character, but for what can be done to increase value. Native American culture places its emphasis on community. Euro-Western prizes the individual. 3. Indigenous peoples celebrate interrelationships with the natural world, creation, rather than living as separate from creation with the freedom and drive to consume it all at will. Number 4, Native American attachment to land is to a particular territory, communally shared with responsibility to the land, rather than privately or individually owned with an eye to development, rather than stewardship. These differences led to a massive clash of culture, spurred on by attitudes such as the one expressed in the doctrine of discovery. This clash, won by Euro-Western forces, resulted in the decimation of the Native American population, disease, genocide, forced eviction that led to starvation, repeated seizure of land that forced the tribes into continually smaller, less arable parcels, deliberate eradication of their language, culture, their own and their children's ethnic identity. That's an astounding introduction. Chapter 1, A Struggle, Resistance, Liberation, and Theological Methodology. Grandmother, grandfather, sacred one above and sacred one below, thank you for this day, for life itself. As you can see from the opening prayer, Native American spirituality is bi-gender. Both are sacred, both are revered. Chapter 1 deals with the methodology of American Indian resistance through political and theological means. Tinker elaborates 4 main tracks to this end. The first of these, colonization and the radicalization of politics, traces the steps of indigenous exploitation in North America through the history of our settlement on the continent. It is horrific and was not only condoned but encouraged by government and society, including the Christian Church. The most important part for me comes at the very end of this section with the question that Tinker poses on page 23. Quote unquote, the methodological question, of course, is this: how will our theologies identify systemic issues like radicalization of politics and then respond with hope for a liberated, transformed future? How indeed. The second methodology concerns class analysis and the liberal colonizer solution to colonial violence. In other words, to move beyond the methodology of Marxism, which doesn't reach deeply enough into the situation, and to discover and create new tools to identify oppression that's not necessarily rooted in economic exploitation, but in the deepest desire of indigenous peoples to maintain their cultural identities and to be respected as independent and worthwhile political entities. Tinker, however, recognizes the right of the colonizers to oppress indigenous peoples. They have no choice but to do so, and to regard the demands of the indigenous peoples for the return of their land as theft. Page 25. This is the political reality of Tinker's theology. He concludes, quote unquote, we must now begin to seriously consider indigenous issues as relating to the poorest of the poor in virtually every region of the world. This issue is global, not just North or South American. His third methodology deals with the colonization of language and categories of analysis. This speaks to the loss of the indigenous people's culture and ethnic identity, their language, social customs, political and economic customs, theology, everything that sets them apart from the colonizing agents. Here, Tinker begins to expose theological differences between Native Americans and Euro-Western tradition. At the heart of his criticism is the anthropomorphic, male-centered image of God that non-Indigenous civilization insists upon. Think back to the opening prayer, calling on grandmother and grandfather. What a beautiful theological balance we as colonizers are not only turning our backs on, but are desperate to obliterate. Tinker's question, page 26, is profound. Can we not begin at least to discuss alternatives for this fundamental theological act of signifying God? This gently segues into the fourth methodology, colonialization and marginalization of women, knowing our past. Tinker begins with calling on indigenous peoples to resist, allowing others to rewrite history to the exclusion of the conquered identity. Remember who you are as a people. Because the colonizer is of a patriarchal point of view, that doesn't mean that all other belief systems should be abandoned. Far from it. The onus should be on the newcomers to understand the value systems already in place and to respect the differences rather than forcing their own belief systems on those they encounter. This is precisely what's wrong with the doctrine of discovery. The conclusion of the chapter sums up Tinker's points, connects him with James Cone's Black liberation theology, and sets the stage for the next chapter. Chapter 2: Creation, Justice, and Peace. Having introduced the political side of theology, Tinker continues in Chapter 2 with eco-political theology in the form of reverence for all creation. He cites a process initiated by the World Council of Churches called Justice, Peace, and the Integrity of Creation, which had the capability of addressing ongoing ongoing global devastation of the environment, but which, in Tinker's opinion, has fallen far short of accepting priorities. Justice should be about balance, not about retribution. To illustrate this, Tinker tells a story about a Native American community needing a tree as a center point of the Sundance ceremony. Rather than merely hacking the tree down and carting it off to its place in the ceremonial arena, the community observes a ritual that honors the tree and its place in the ceremony. After the community has gathered its thoughts and are of like mind, they approach the tree in a spiritual and sacred way, blessing the tree, explaining their purpose, and thanking the tree for its sacrifice. To do so provides some balance for the violent act of taking the life of the tree. As the tree is felled, it is caught rather than being allowed to fall anywhere, trimmed carefully, and borne away to the hole prepared for it in the ceremony. It is then draped in colorful prayer offerings, complete with words of apology, gratitude, purpose, and promise. In short, the tree is treated with dignity and respect that few human beings will experience in their lifetime. This is the key word for Tinker: respect for creation, but within certain parameters. Tinker believes that we as theologians have our priorities wrong. Despite the creeds we confess, we neglect to put creation first. More than that, the oppressed conditions of our brothers and sisters around the world should be of greater priority than the condition of a fish in a polluted lake. Not to accept it as such places us in complicity with the oppressors rather than as agents of justice and redemption. All is important, all is related, but some things must come first. Tinker postulates that if concern for God's creation comes first, justice and peace will follow in suit. Creation is the beginning and the end of the circle that began with the Word, continues with the Word made flesh until God's kingdom is at hand, which won't happen if we don't get our priorities right. Creation figures deeply in Tinker's theology, in his Christology, and ultimately in his eschatology. The priority of creation brings everything else into focus and aligns everything in its proper place, which of course restores the balance and harmony to creation. It creates a circle, eternally in balance, eternally renewing itself. Tinker himself sums it up nicely on page 56 when he says, quote unquote, if our theology can begin to wrestle seriously with the necessity of balance and harmony in all of creation, then our self-image as part of creation must also be deeply affected. May justice, followed by genuine peace, flow out of our concern for one another and all creation. Chapter 3, Eco-Justice and American Indian Sovereignty. George Tinker has taught me a new word, ecocide. It is genocide of the environment brought on, in Tinker's view, by not understanding or not caring about the interrelationship of creation, of putting one species above all else in importance. In some sense, that translates into white privilege because most of the land that is being destroyed through uranium mining, nuclear testing, fracking, and oil exploitation, deforestation, and other forms of pollution, ecological devastation are those belonging to indigenous peoples. Sacrifice land. Part of the issue seems to lie in language. Native American spirituality has not the concept of love in terms of God loving creation. It's not just the translation of the Greek agape, but of the whole concept of anthropomorphism and human emotions that Western traditions invest in the ideal of God. There might be amount of pleasure or displeasure with the actions of human beings, but quote unquote, for God so loved the world does not resonate. The concept of creation presents a problem as the Euro-Western version denies the interconnection of all creation and places humans in a superior position and imbues them with what Native Americans see as undeserved privilege. It lacks balance. It lacks reciprocity. It brings up the different views of emphasis on space, Native Americans, and time, Euro-Western colonizers. Which brings Tinker to one of the key points of his book, The Sovereignty of the Land, Eco-Justice for the Damage We Have Done, i.e., return to balance and harmony, and the theology of liberation of the Native American. Tinker insists they are linked. The politics of sovereignty of the land, which the United States government won't accept, the restoration of balance that can only occur when the attitude of white privilege is gone, and the ultimate liberation of Native Americans to resume his ethnic identity with the respect that it deserves. Chapter 4, Christology and Colonialism. Given the wide gulf between Euro-Western understanding of the Gospels and the nature of salvation, and the indigenous spiritual connection with all that God has created, I'm not sure the Bible can offer a liberation message in the same way it can to the African American or the oppressed Spanish American. 500 years of conquest and oppression have left little path to healing through the very religion wielded in such a destructive manner. Tinker is of two minds on the subject. On one hand, he feels the inappropriateness of such an endeavor, although many Native American ceremonies mirrored the message of suffering and salvation, restoration, found in the Gospels. They were misunderstood, unintentionally or deliberately, and labeled satanic or idolatry. Unlike other rites, there's no sense of placating God to turn away the divine wrath, which is too anthropomorphic for the Native Americans, but instead an expression of connectedness and an effort to restore balance and harmony. In this case, Euro-Western religions have no liberating message for the indigenous peoples. After analyzing Christology in its political, its use in subjugating and dehumanizing Native Americans, and cultural, the fall redemption themes that were so devastatingly used against the Native American culture, resulting in several points of decolonizing Indian Christology, Tinker concludes that we must be careful if we are not to repeat the damaging practices that sought to supplant rather than integrate Native American spirituality with biblical Christology. It is possible to do. Tinker, a Lutheran minister and teacher of Osage traditions, is proof of that. He closes the chapter with several talking points that illustrate the appropriateness of doing just that, something unimaginable if we leave the argument with his earlier statements. His final argument is of the metaphor of Corn Mother as Jesus. Talk about a deep connection with medieval mystic and feminine womanist theologians who find the feminine images in Jesus power and cosmic balancing. Page 110. Chapter 5. Abjugation, Violence, Missions, and American Indians. The key to this chapter, I believe, is the emphasis on pluralism and how the missionary conquest of the Americas missed the mark. It's not about the New Age rediscovery of indigenous spiritual beliefs that get mistakenly lumped in with pagan rites. It's not about eradicating American spiritual practices and replacing them with acceptable Christian values and practices. It's not about insulting indigenous peoples by honoring those who turned their backs on their culture and ethnic identity only to be martyred for it. It's about the unlikelihood of pluralistic religions, a pluralistic religious acceptance, given the Catholic Church's role, collusion, in validating and enforcing the subjugation and often eradication of indigenous cultures, and the fact that mainline churches are supported by the very people who reap the benefits of the destruction of the ecosystem. The language of the Gospels also seems to be an obstacle for Tinker. In so many of the descriptions that are so precious to Euro-Western Christians, so many of the descriptions that are so precious to Euro-Western Christians have no resonance for Native Americans. Tinker asks, quote unquote, what exactly does it mean that God is redeeming the world? Page 121. These concepts have no connection with the Native American understanding of the balance and harmony of creation, of life. He ends the chapter with the thought, don't preach Jesus, be Jesus. Don't give lip service to the teachings of God's Son while engaging in practices that would make him weep. Lead by example. Don't worship him, follow him. As we said back in the 60s, be the change you want to see. Chapter 6, American Indian Liberation. Quote unquote, if Jesus is not to be our starting point, then we must look for another, more unconventional and much more complex. Page 129. Here we begin 4 aspects on the road to American Indian liberation. Tensions with Christianity, exchange of histories, Canaanites versus cowboys and Indians, Indian challenges to our Amur European colonizer relatives, and challenges for the Indian people that will ultimately lead to liberation and respect that the Native Americans should have enjoyed from the beginning. Analysis of each of these aspects could be a book. Taken together sequentially, they open up a methodology for connecting with other liberation theologies and moving Christianity toward a non oppressive relationship with the Native American peoples. It is a debt Tinker believes we owe to the ancestors who sacrificed so much.